Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Nima podcast, where I interview creatives, artists, and innovators about their worldviews and stories. Today, I'm joined by my guest Rob, who goes by the artist name Carmacace. He's a poet, visual artist, and philosophical thinker who has been selling his poetry and artworks as NFTs. So, Rob, welcome to the podcast. It's great to finally have you here.
Hey, how's it going, Nima? Thanks so much for having me, man. I really appreciate it.
Of course, and thanks for joining me so early. I know it's 7 in the morning for you, so appreciate that.
Yeah, no
um,
worries. I'm a little bit of an early riser usually, so I'm
that's great. That's great. So, could you give a brief overview of your story for people that don't know? Maybe touching on how your relationship with creativity started and has developed throughout your life.
okay. Yeah, I knew this question was coming, but I'm still. I think we'll start here. So I think it started even before me. Like I'll put it that way. My dad definitely has a creative streak. Um, he does like bonsai. He does drawings. He does a lot of photography and stuff. And I think a lot of that kind of came from him. But also, he he has a serious deals with serious mental health issues as well. He has a condition, a diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder, which is like basically like a combination of schizophrenia and bipolar. So sometimes seeing and hearing things that aren't there, uh, you know, changes in mood that are pretty erratic. And um, one of the things that I've kind of read, trying to learn more about him and that is that there is definitely a correlation between next of kin with someone with that kind of condition and creativity. So I think a lot of it kind of stems from there, even before me in a way. So I think that's an important part of the story that I haven't really shared too much. Like I don't talk about it too much because I feel like it's not fully my story. It's kind of his story, and I don't. It's one of those things where you don't want to give a perception about someone, especially when you're talking about mental health, before meeting the person. It almost kind of colors the way that you see them. But at the same time, there's also um, uh, there's a stigma around it, right? Around mental health, and part of the effort is to kind of to do away with that stigma. So that's partly why I mentioned that, to start before I'm even here. That's, I think, where the creativity kind of begins for me.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, as far as like myself, um, thinking back, and I don't want to go like too far, but there was growing up, I was really into like Marvel comics, collecting comics and stuff. And I remember one of my friends and I, we would just create our own characters. We draw our own characters. So I think the visual part kind of started there with just an interest in the whole like Marvel and superheroes and all that, and we made our own little universe. And I think that's where I learned some of the uh, just the drawing, just like the basic stuff. And as far as writing, when I was young, I was doing really well academically. This is still like elementary school, and um, the teachers, I guess, were encouraging me to try for GT, which is like gifted and talented. And so the first thing you have to do is take an intelligence test, right? And so I take the test, and I think you're supposed to score like a 130 or something, and I scored like a 126. I was like just shy. And the reason they end up putting me into GT at that time was because of the writing I would do. So like any other kid, we'd have like these vocabulary tests. And instead of just doing like one sentence with one vocabulary word, I'd put them all into like one sentence. I just kind of like have fun with it. And I guess they saw that as writing well. I don't know. I was just having fun with it. But um, so they put me into GT, and I think that was the earliest kind of um, signs. And then it didn't really like kind of flourish until later. And I guess we can kind of get to that in a little bit.
Yeah, could you just describe what GT is for? Because I don't know what that is.
Yeah, so it stands for gifted and talented. Um, there's a lot of controversy about it and whatnot. But it's basically like if a kid is kind of excelling, you want to kind of meet them where they're at. Um, you don't want to, you don't want them to be bored. You don't want like if it's kind of to basically try to if they're doing better than the general age at that time, it's to help kind of foster that, I guess, if that makes
Yep.
sense. I don't know if I'm doing it justice.
No, I think I got what it means now. Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks for describing that. So I was reading through your poems in preparation for this and your the NFTs that you have up. I read, and I also read your Medium articles. I read the one on chaotic clarity, which I gathered is your very first poem that you wrote. And
Yeah.
from the story that you had written, it seemed that what you were saying that it came seemingly out of nowhere, as you hadn't written a poem before, and it was quite spontaneous sort of creation. And I relate with this event in a certain way because my first ever artwork as well seemed to come out of nowhere, and I wasn't really artistic before that moment, and it wasn't the intentional thing. It was just very automatic, very spontaneous. So my question for you regarding that sort of incident was, what do you think led to you? What do you think led to that first act of creation? Like, why did that first poem come out at that specific time, seemingly spontaneously?
Yeah, so perfect segue, man. And I think that's something that I resonate with in your story too, because I've heard you share that before, and I've when I collected the mandala from you, I remember reading back the full story, and that was something that I resonated with as well. Um, and this is actually the next point in the story. So it was a time when, kind of like the title says of the piece, chaotic clarity, where things are just chaos. It I don't want to get too personal about it, but it related to my grandpa on my mom's side, and he was having health issues, and there was a lot going on in the family and so forth. And I was driving to work, and the first couple of lines just came into my head. Um, Anticipatory inscription of confrontation and contradiction, and it was just there, and it was just repeating, almost like it wanted to be on paper. And so it was just kind of, I have like a maybe an hour long commute to work, and so this was just kind of ruminating in my mind. And as soon as I got to work, and I get to work early, like before, at the time anyway, before everyone would get there and stuff. So I just sat down, and a poem just flowed out. It wasn't, I'd never written a poetry before. It wasn't anything planned. It just it was like those words just needed to be on paper, and it happened in a flash too. It was like I wrote those first couple of lines, and everything just kind of flowed out afterwards. I don't know if I even edited anything after that, but I just kind of sat there. I was like, wow, I just wrote a poem. It just needed. I guess I just needed an outlet because everything was so chaotic. And then from there, it never really left. It was like I'd never written like this before, and then I did, and then it was always kind of there, and it was like this a lot of art for me has been an outlet. A lot of times where it's, something is chaotic or stressful, and it's just a means to kind of get that out and express it, um, in a way other than conversation, I guess, and even visually too. Um, so I wrote the poem, and there's a visual that goes with it too, right? So um, I had been drawing before that, which also the same kind of spontaneous experience. Like I said, I'd drawn like characters and things, and I developed like the dexterity to draw, but I'd never drawn anything that was more abstract than just lines and whatnot. But uh, and this wasn't such a chaotic period, but I remember just kind of waiting for someone. I was just trying to kill time, and I just started doing just random lines on a paper, in fact, on an envelope. Um, and then when it was finally time to go, and I kind of shared it, and I was like, wow, what is that? And I guess there was positive feedback about it, so I continued to do that, and that was that was sort of the period when I was in college. And it's funny too. I remember sitting in like lectures and just drawing while the person was lecturing. And I think a lot of people kind of looked at me like, you know, this guy's just goofing off and he doesn't care. But there's something about it where when I'm drawing, I'm very in tune um, with the audio and what's going on around me. So I'm actually listening to the lecture and I'm taking it all in, but I'm drawing while I'm doing it. And so that was something that kind of developed while I was in college. The poetry was a little bit later, so just to kind of get the timeline right there.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I also relate with the drawing, but while being very present still, because you sort of get into a flow state, and yeah, you are very present, but you just the act of creating the drawing or whatever it is actually keeps you present. So yeah, I get what you mean by that one. And yeah, for the creation of the poem, again, I relate because my story when I first created my first ever artwork, it, I mean, it wasn't. It was a period of chaos, but it wasn't intense chaos like on that particular day. But it was
Mhm.
maybe months and the months beforehand were months that were like confusing and a lot of things that were coming up that I didn't know how to deal with. And then, yeah, the first act of creation, that first artwork, was an outlet, as you said, but
Mhm.
almost like things sort of bubbling up to the surface, and then it just breaks through by itself.
Exactly, man. Yeah, like, and like I said, I remember you sharing that in other interviews and reading that, and it was one of those things that I don't know, like spontaneity is an interesting thing too, right? Like um,
Yeah,
it's like it's something that's it's there. It's almost like um, one of the I'm really into psychology too, and I don't mean to like sidetrack us or anything, but um, one of the
mhm,
writers that I'm interested in is Oliver Sacks, and he really writes. He was like a neurologist and psychologist and whatnot. Writes about spontaneity and how it feels like it's something that just happens in that spur of the moment, but it's almost like it's been there, kind of happening under the surface, and whatever's in that moment just kind of it all kind of comes together, and that's both with something like creating, but also sometimes with problem solving, right? When you're dealing with a difficult problem and it kind of hits you when you least expect it, like you're taking a shower and then boom, you have the answer. So sorry
yeah.
for the for the tangent.
No, 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 not at all. But yeah, it feels like almost like maybe unconscious because I'm also into psychology, so it's not a divergence from the conversation at all. But yeah, the psychologist that I remember I was reading at the time when I made my first work was Carl Jung, and obviously he talks a lot about the unconscious and versus the conscious mind. And yeah, I think the way he was sort of, or he conceptualized it, or the way that I gathered from it was that you have all these things unconsciously going on, and at that moment of creation, it's like finally the unconscious sort of gathers itself into um, some sort of a structure and then becomes conscious. And then that creation, the act of creation, is us making that those unconscious parts conscious into one sort of outlet or sort of one sort of product.
Yeah, yeah, I remember that. Carl Jung, you were for the mandala, right? You were like, oh, I want to try and create
Yeah.
this. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, so that's awesome. One thing that I've noticed with like I guess it's similar themes, and ever since like those first artworks, I feel like as we open ourselves up more, sort of mentally, emotionally, or spiritually, more and more art comes to us, and we can get it more from different places, and we also get more sensitive to all sorts of stimuli, including the good and the bad. And I've noticed this theme in some of your own poems, like this sensitivity. So yeah, have you noticed this sort of change within sensitivity within yourself throughout your creative journey? And yeah, how do you feel about it?
so sensitivity to creativity,
Yeah,
is that
or
what
just
you mean?
sensitivity
Yeah.
to all sorts of stimuli,
Y-
any sort of
Okay,
input that
okay,
comes
okay.
in.
Yeah. No, for sure. I think so one of the things too is those initial things kind of happen, right? Like the writing of the poem, and then I made a visual that went with it. Um, but it wasn't. It was always kind of this side thing. It was like when something would grab like that again, I would stop it and foster it, but not always, right? It was like whenever it would really grab me, then I'd end up writing a poem or drawing something. Um, but being in this space, like being in the NFT space and being around all of these artists and seeing this every day, um, it's definitely had an influence for sure. And I don't know exactly what spurred it, but there was a point where I just I felt compelled to write a poem every day. So I did this for it lasted for 100 days, and part of it was that you know before this space, too, this is part of the story I haven't really shared, is that um, all of this creating that I was kind of doing here and there, I never really shared it with anyone. It was very personal. It was just for myself. It wasn't like I was trying to monetize it or I didn't even care about like feedback or whatever with myself, you know. Um, and then getting in this space and uh, sort of seeing what was happening or just starting to happen with poetry around the time when I first started, um, it was really inspiring. Also, just like seeing all the different work and whatnot. Um, but I didn't really have like a body of work, and some of the stuff I'm still going to keep to myself. You know, like I'm not going to share everything that I write. Um, but I just wanted to foster. I don't know. It was just like a compulsion, and so I started writing, consciously making an effort to write a poem a day. And during that period, I really felt what you were describing. Just kind of, it's like you're in that kind of daily practice. Like you're going to be writing every day, and it sort of makes you more in tune with your environment. So you start to pick up on things that you might have not paid attention to before. So for sure during that period, and I'm kind of towards the end because I didn't know how long I was going to do it. I just said, I'm going to start writing a poem and we'll see what happens with this. Um, and right when I was getting to around day 100, like day 95 or something, I remember just feeling almost uh, like I wanted to turn it off. It was like I couldn't. It was like I tried to do something else, and a like idea for a poem would hit me. And with writing, like if you can't, if you don't acknowledge it in that moment, like the idea is lost. It's very difficult to kind of pull back the same words and revisit it if you don't put it down on paper right then and there. I'd be going through my daily routine, whatever I'm doing, teaching and whatnot, and I'd have this like idea, like, damn, I need to get this down on paper, and it was almost like to a fault. Um, so I guess that's why I decided, okay, at day 100, I'm gonna check this and take a step back, and I still write probably close to every day, but it's not a conscious effort to make sure, okay, I'm writing something every day, if that all makes sense.
Yeah, it does, and it's an interesting process. The one actually, I was going to ask about that project, but the chain associations project with the one poem a day for 100 days. But I'm glad you brought it up yourself. So it's interesting that because you're saying almost at the end you want to turn it off because you were getting so much, so many different ideas, and you had to write them down. So did that happen automatically, where you just because you were doing a poem a day, you were just ready to write a poem every day, or did you also encounter any sort of let's say writer's block or creativity blocks? Because there's periods where we sort of as creatives we're like begging for some inspiration, or we're begging for like some um any new artwork to come out of us. But then on the other side, there's periods like the one that you said where you have so much, and you also want to turn it off. So yeah, how was that with like regard to creative block or the flow state? How did you conceptualize all that?
Yeah, so one thing with me, and I know this might, I don't know, I don't know if it's the same for people that participate in like a daily practice. I know some artists will wake up, have your coffee, doodle, like there's structure to everything, and for me it wasn't that. It was I wouldn't unless it's like gonna be like almost 12 a.m. and I have to get the poem done before the day is over, I wouldn't sit down and intentionally say, okay, I'm gonna write now. I would go throughout my day and wait for it to come. And almost almost every time it would come. I know there's at least one poem in that 100 where I'm basically writing about writer's block. That was, I think, the one, like, it wasn't even so much writer's block. I think it was a day where I had written like 3 or 4 poems that day, and that last one, it was like, because it was for other things. I do a lot of ekphrastic poetry, which is where you're writing poems about artwork. Um, and so I think I had done a couple of those, and I was like, I have to do my daily poem because I kept it kind of as this whole separate thing. And by that time, I was sitting down and it was, late, and I was like, I don't know what the hell to write about. I'm just gonna write about not being able to write. Like sometimes that's an artwork in itself. Just expressing that
Mhm.
feeling, right? And that's something that related to us because I felt like, man, this poem sucks, and I remember tweeting it out, and at least 1 or 2 people were like, "Oh, I really resonate with this one. Like this is my favorite." I was like, "Okay, you never know what people are gonna gravitate towards." So definitely experienced some of that, but more of the opposite, I think, mostly.
Yeah. So have you like do you encounter writer's blocks more frequently, or like how do you deal with them when they do come?
Hmm. Um, well, that I don't. It's not often that I. So there's. I guess this is part of it too. Is the process, right? And that's the thing that really intrigues me about art is the process. I'm not so concerned finished product. Like that's what everybody sees and that's what everyone, you know, comments on and appreciates. But um, for me, the process, I've kind of identified two means for process. For me, there's that spontaneous, like I'm not even thinking about it. The pen is just doing what it wants to do. And then there's like the intentional one where, okay, I'm going to write this poem about this thing, or I'm going to draw this abstract piece with this idea in mind. And they're two very different processes, but at the same time, I think every piece, written or visual, um, is a blend of both. But usually, I just kind of wait for it to happen. I don't force things. I just kind of like let it kind of come to me and wait for it. Unless there's something, I'm specifically writing it for something. And that's when it's more difficult. I think that's when you hit those moment writer's block, when you're saying, okay, I'm going to write this at this time, and these are the parameters. Um, that's when it becomes a little more difficult. And it's interesting too because it's like that whole discussion about um, if constraints lead to creativity, or if like the freedom of the blank page um, is kind of paradoxically, the paradox of choice. Like there's too many possibilities, so you can't decide, and nothing gets done.
Mhm.
um, yeah, I don't know. It's Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so letting it come to you naturally, or sort of just committing to the process in a way. So, what is your writing process, if I may ask? Do you have a particular process for writing your poems, or is it mostly spontaneous?
It's mostly spontaneous, but it's like it's usually like an idea will grab me, or and that idea will sort of formulate into like one line. Like there will just be like, oftentimes for me, there's definitely an auditory quality to the way I write. Like I've been told that I'm a lyrical poet, so that I pay attention to the sound of the word. They kind of flow together. Um, and it usually starts
Mhm.
with just a single. It usually just starts with a single line, like something will grab me. Like it has a certain ring to it, or it's like a way of phrasing something that I hadn't heard before. And I think that's part of creativity, right? Is being sort of surprised in a way that you maybe have an expectation and no, it's something else. Um, so I usually just start with one line, and that from there, I don't know, like I don't really know how to explain it because I'm not a I'm definitely not a traditionalist when it comes to writing poetry. I don't follow poetic form. You know, even like coming into the space, I knew little of poetic. I know that you know, there's questions about like what is, you know, what is poetry anyway, you know, and to me it's if there's any artistic intent, or if anything is received artistically, even if you didn't write it for it to be meant to be artistic, if it's received that way, to me that's still a poem. So I don't follow like the typical structures. I just let it flow. So um, I think people receive that different ways. Like some people embrace that, like, and others are kind of, you know, this isn't like fully like this isn't what poetry is supposed to be. Um, and that's, I mean, there's a lot of influences. We didn't really talk about influences too much, but I definitely am interested in some uh, poets. Like Emily Dickinson is one of my favorites, and she's um, I don't know if you're familiar with her story, but she was basically a recluse and she did all this writing mostly in private, and people didn't really discover until, you know, posthumously after she passed away. And then she was renowned as this tremendous poet. Um, but she was kind of writing in seclusion and for herself, and um, didn't follow all of the poetic form and so forth. And I really resonated with that, you know. And like I said before, previous to this space, I would just write and create for myself. It wasn't like, you know, I'm not like tweeting this out or whatever. And there's like something about that, about just creating for the sake of creating, that I think is really important and something to try to keep central. I'm losing my train of thought. I'm on a tangent about Dickinson. Oh, what I was also getting to is that not only like poets like Dickinson and like William Blake, who did visual artwork and poetry, but I was also influenced like by like hip hop and whatnot growing up. So like someone like Black Thought, I think is tremendous. And I know you've tweeted out uh, things as well,
Yeah.
about different, yeah, and so you can kind of
Hmm.
you know, there's not this structure that you have to follow. It just is, you know, and it's still a creative process. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, 100%. I resonate with that a lot too because I mean, yeah, when I started my own artworks, I had zero education in art or really even studying of art independently. But it was more just letting letting the inspiration come to me and then doing with it whatever I want to do. So yeah, and I think there's a certain almost purity to that sort of art form, which is uh, without following external structures or influences. But it's, I feel like that's what real art is like, when it just fully comes from the inside and it's not really trying to be something else or copy something else, but it really is with your own structure or no structure. So yeah, I resonate with that a lot. And yeah, the hip hop part too, of course. Yeah, it's one of my biggest influences. Black Thought, I haven't listened to him too much. I need to do
Mm.
that. But yeah, I
I'll
guess.
send you. Sorry, I'll send you a link. He did a freestyle that was like 10 minutes long, and it was like the most amazing thing I've one of the most amazing things I've ever heard. So I'll
Yeah,
I'll send that afterwards.
amazing, amazing. Looking forward to it. Yeah, for me, Kendrick Lamar has been like monumental in my journey. And yeah, even though obviously there's many different perceptions about him because he's in the mainstream, but I feel like, yeah, I mean, his recent album could be a good place to start for someone if he wants to really pay attention to how he's using poetry as a way to sort of communicate deep messages to the mainstream. I feel like is a very important thing that needs to be done. So yeah, hip hop also resonate on that. One of the things you mentioned a bit before about when you said you become more in tune with your environment, and something you noticed uh, towards the end of that a poem a day China Association project, where you were so in tune and noticing things about your environment that you maybe you wouldn't typically notice. So I want to ask, because I know that you're based in Hawaii. So I was gonna ask, do you notice the environment in Hawaii influencing your art in any particular way, and influencing your art and thoughts, and in what ways? And yeah, what is living in Hawaii like for you?
Oh man, yeah, I'm born and raised, and I think it's one of those things like I have to be reminded of, that I sometimes take this place for granted, that um but definitely there's definitely an artistic influence. I did a I did a poem um recently. It was for an art competition and or a poetry competition, and it was Ana Maria Caballero was another tremendous poet in the space who's like moving mountains. Um, we were doing like a poetry workshop that I was kind of working with her on, and she had mentioned like, oh, let's do this as the prompt, and it was called Nature Speaks, and I'm forgetting the name of the um, what they call themselves, but the idea was to write a poem from the perspective of an animal. And when I heard the prompt, I immediately knew what I was going to write, and it had to do with it tied back to Hawaii. It's about this this native bird here called the manu oku. It's like a white tern would be the other name for it. But this bird it's endemic here, and it's I don't think it's technically endangered, but I think it's considered threatened. So it's like you can't touch these birds and so forth. There are these white seafaring birds, um, and they kind of there's no one knows for sure, but they kind of theorize that ancient Polynesian navigators probably saw these birds because they'll go out to the ocean during the day and then they fly back to land later on. So if you see them out at ocean in the ocean, you know that there's land nearby. So like Polynesian navigators used to navigate by stars and currents and things like that. And I remember when I saw that prompt, I had to write about this bird. It was like it was something that had kind of impacted me earlier on in my life. It was kind of one of those things that just kind of happened. This isn't really spontaneously, but it was like I had no knowledge of these birds before, and then we had to trim these or cut down some of these giant mango trees at my grandparents' property or great grandparents' property, and they're like these enormous trees. And come to find out that there was some of these birds nesting in those trees, and I didn't know anything about them before. It's kind of embarrassing to say, to be honest, but it was such an interesting experience. So we had to cut these trees. This is their home for these birds, and there's this whole process to it. You have to make sure that there's no eggs in the tree and so forth. But it really opened my eyes. It was like it it was this interesting experience. One of those like those experience that feels very synchronous. So this all kind of happened. We had to trim these trees, and after learning about these birds, I find that I see them everywhere. So it was this thing that kind of stuck with me afterwards. So I'm a teacher outside of this space, and the school that I teach at is literally the street across the Iolani Palace, which is this palace where the monarchy used to reside when there was kings and queens here in Hawaii. And these birds, a lot of them congregate at the palace. So there's all this symbolism in all these things, and it just all this kind of just happened, and I wasn't even aware of them. I became aware of them, and it was something that's been kind of um, like I always knew I'd write about these birds, and it wasn't until that prompt happened that poem came to life. And I made a visual with it and whatnot, and um, I I think I'm not sure if they're minting it on a different chain or whatnot, but it was featured in an event in Amsterdam, and it was definitely a highlight for me um, because I'd never, again, before this space, I would just kind of write in a silo on my own and never shared it. And to enter one poetry competition and to be, it wasn't the winning poem per se. There was a winner, and then there was like three of us that was like the next tier. But to be acknowledged like that, it really meant a lot. And I think that's, so there's this influence of being here for sure that I don't even always consciously think about in a way.
Yeah. No, that's beautiful. But how the environment affects you and how that journey led to the artwork being created and the poetry being created. Because of course, environment affects each person has their own unique environment. Mm. So, when does your best poetry come to you nowadays?
I think it's similar to before. It's when I'm just feeling something really deeply. It's like, um, again, not when I stop and say I'm gonna write this. Well, I mean, I don't know. I like, there's it's interesting. Like I just I mean, I just wrote the past couple of days too, and it's um, that was the opposite. It was intentional, but it was definitely things that I felt deeply. So um, my grandma just passed not too long ago, last month, and she had dementia, and she'd had it for years. And this is a whole another side story, and maybe it ties back to the film about chaotic clarity, because that was the grandpa in that situation. But um, she passed away, and I, for her eulogy, I wrote a poem, and I shared that. And then today, like I mentioned to you earlier, and she actually opened the door a little earlier. I don't know if you're gonna hear it on the audio, but today is my daughter's birthday, and she knows that I like to write, and she asked me to write her a poem. So I wrote her a poem last night too. So I think it's a matter of just feeling something deeply. I think that's when, because then it's coming from a genuine place, right? Like it's an intentional thing because you're dealing with this loss, or you're dealing with, this special occasion, or if it's just going about my day and something just just sometimes things just grab you. For whatever reason, it just makes you feel. And like, yeah, like you're saying, like that's kind of the purest place where it just comes from you.
Hmm. Yeah, that's beautiful, and it makes sense. And yeah, my condolences for your grandma and happy birthday to your daughter.
Thanks, man.
um, yeah. So what has been? It's a bit of a segue, but so what has been the role of, let's say, philosophical or spiritual thinking in your life?
So like I mentioned, my well, I guess I'll start here. So I'm not religious. I'm not like, you know I don't subscribe to any religion. um, and my background is in psychology. So when I went to college, I didn't know what I was going to do. Um, and the three things that were kind of at the top of the list was psychology, education, and art. And I ended up, I'm kind of, all the three are still kind of overlapping to this day. Um, but I ended up going the psychology route because I guess at the time it was something that interested me the most. It was something, like I said, I have personal, reasons for taking an interest in it, but it was always just interesting to learn about your mind and the mind of others, and why people behave the way to do it they do, and just trying to make sense of that. Um, and so it's definitely like a foundational, psychology is kind of a foundational piece for me. There's a lot of the writing I do, there's like an element of consciousness and so forth. And that it always kind of tends to come out. And I'll talk about like brain structures and neural connections and all this kind of stuff. That So there's definitely an influence there. And I don't know if I don't know if that's like so much spiritual, but it's sort of like what kind of fits that part for me, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, actually, my interest in, because I'm also not religious, but I feel like I'm a spiritual person. But I feel like my interest in all of it did stem from psychology as well, and just thinking and studying about the mind and your mind. And I feel like there's a natural progression from psychology to thinking philosophically, and then ultimately spirituality.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely agree. And and resonate with that too, man. Um,
Mhm. Uh, what this is a big question, but what is your definition of freedom?
See, I was hoping we'd get to the philosophical stuff too. Um, I really enjoyed the conversation with Craigo too. Um, I know
Thanks, man.
you guys got pretty deep into it.
Yeah, yeah.
So like I mentioned earlier, like freedom. I mean, freedom is it's. I think on the surface, it's sort of this um, the ability to choose, right? Like to have choice, but I also feel like it's something that's kind of paradoxical, right? Like when you like that idea of the paradox of choice, that when you have too many choices, you're stuck in indecision. Like you can't decide because there's too many choices. And at the same time, in terms of creativity, that if there's constraints, um, oftentimes that'll lead to things like it doesn't feel comfortable, right? Like when there's constraints and you like say if you're doing something like if you have to do something like a commissioned work and someone wants you to write something or to create something visually and these are the constraints that you have to do but it'll push you outside of what you would have done otherwise like I've heard a lot of conversations about how artists have grown um, through those experiences like I hate doing commissions but I learned so much through this experience that because you would create something that you never or probably never would have created otherwise because these constraints were placed upon you. So there's I don't know there's this kind of push and pull with the concept of freedom for me.
Yeah, I resonate with that. Um, yeah, because instinctually, it feels like constraints. Uh, well, they constrain freedom
Yeah,
and they stop you from sort of acting on your freedom. But sometimes, total freedom can be a bit scary and also paralyzing, maybe in a way. That if you have too many options and if you have potentially infinite options of things to do, or just concept or whatever realm you want to think about it in, you end up doing nothing.
yeah,
But if there's some constraints, then you have at least some. Mm, I don't know how to fully explain it, but yeah, you have some foundations or some
yeah,
structure of sorts to then be free within.
yeah, yeah. Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Mm. Okay, so we share the same vision on that.
Yeah.
um, okay, the next another big question, but I asked this of
Yeah.
all my guests as well. What is
Let's
your
do it.
definition of what is your definition of success?
Oh, success. That's a good one, man. I think and I'm kind of framing everything in terms of art, but um, I think success in that respect is to just fall in love with the craft. Like if you truly love what you're doing, like that is the success. And I think also I'm a very big believer that and I think most people have adopted this as well, that it's the journey and not the destination, or the journey is the destination. And it's just falling in love with being in that journey and being in that moment and working towards whatever it is. I that would be that's that's real success because it's more fulfilling than any sort of material type of success.
Yeah, 100%. And I guess it keeps you present if you're in love with your craft. Then it's almost like you're in love with the process and again or the journey, as you said. So it's like a present thing that's happening all the time, as opposed to anticipating something in the future.
Yes.
That yeah. So it's something that will
Yeah.
always be there.
Yeah. There's something that like when you're yearning and anticipating there's you're almost putting yourself in this different mental state, right? Like you're wanting something and it's I don't think that's a good necessarily a good place to be. I don't know.
Yeah, I can feel trapped by the goal
Yeah.
of success. Yeah. So for the last little segment I have here, I want to talk a bit about your experience with NFT poetry, because obviously it's a world that's starting up, and even like me making the announcement for this podcast, there was a few people that reached out to me that they didn't even know NFT poetry was a thing. They're like, oh, poets can get into NFTs as well. Um, so yeah, what has been your experience with NFT poetry and releasing your poems as NFTs?
Um, so for me, I when I got into the space like over a year ago already, and I think I first got in. It was not long afterwards that ether poems became a thing, right? It was by Artchick, and Artemis was involved, and there was a lot of um, tremendous poets that were involved in that space, and um, it definitely showed to me that there was potential for literary NFTs within this space. And something that I have gravitated towards, and this was never like before this space, before getting into NFTs and whatnot. Like I said, the chaotic clarity, I had already made that, and it was kind of pairing this abstract representation um, of how I perceive that feeling of the poem and come them together. But I, imagined it in this physical form where maybe the poem would be on the back of it. And part of it too was that like I said, I didn't really share my work, especially the poetry. So I kind of envisioned it where they'd have this visual, and if you happen to turn, behind the frame and you'd see this written portion, it was like this whole other layer to it. And so that was already kind of playing with before the space. Um, and you start to see this evolution because when you're working digitally, I mean, the potentials are limitless. Like there's really no limit on what you can do because you can include audio, you can include visuals, you can include video and motion, both these different pieces kind of coming together. And there's in this sort of progression. I don't want to say it's necessarily towards that because I think there's definitely place for just written poetry as well. Like a lot of like the 100 days, I'm just writing a poem and just sharing that as text. But it's a different experience to read the words on a page versus hearing someone share them verbally, right? Like it's more of an intimate feeling. I feel like to hear someone recite a poem. Um, and I
Yeah,
have to say this too. I haven't mentioned it earlier, but like I said, I never really shared my work before this space, and definitely never shared them like out loud verbally. And now I'm co-hosting with Digi, and I see some friends here with Chelsea and Brian here. Um, but that has been a definitely a part of my growth in this space is kind of opening up to even like just speaking and talking about these things. And so the pieces that I've done on foundation anyway have been a combination of like a visual abstract representation of the poem, and it usually starts with the poem. But the space itself is definitely growing from that point last year. I don't know when it was, maybe like April or May of 2021 was, I think, around the time that Ether Poems was getting started. And the progression from there has been, tremendous from seeing all different poetry spaces. And there's a crypto writers board. There's a lot of other poets that are coming into the space. Anna Maria, Callan, um, Sasha Stiles, they created a whole platform, the verse for poetry, where they're trying to onboard traditional poets and um, pair them with crypto artists, native crypto artists. So there's definitely been a lot of growth since then, and it's cool to hear that there's still people still learning about that and kind of finding out that poetry is a thing. It definitely is, and something I'm enjoying being a part of for sure.
it's great to hear that the market for is growing and the technologies around it are growing as well. I still feel like there's a, I still feel like poetry isn't as popular as it deserves
Yeah.
to be
Mhm.
as like an art form. Um, why do you think that is? Is it just that we have a short attention span, don't want to read stuff, or why do you think poetry isn't as popular as it deserves to be?
That's I think that's exactly it, man. I think, you know, especially in this kind of environment where I mean we're online, right? Like we're doing a chat over Twitter Spaces, where to me our metaverse right now is Twitter. Um, you know, that's where everything is being shared. That's where the conversation is being had. That's where you see the sale happening and so forth. And um, a lot of times people, you know, if you're scrolling through your feed and you're going to be grabbed by something visual. You're not going to, you know, it takes a certain person to be looking for text, to wanting to read text. You know, not everyone's going to
Yeah,
be seeking that out in the space. So it's definitely like a niche within an already niche market. So it's definitely smaller. And I think, like I said, I think combining it with visuals and audio, and it's not a prerequisite by any means. I think there's a space for all types of poetry regardless. And there's a lot of experimental things as well, but I think there's something about that, yeah, about reading and text and you know almost being averse to that in a lot of ways. A lot of people might be so.
yeah, yeah. I like the idea of mixing it with sound and visual, or I mean, I guess it doesn't even have to be like purely abstract, but
Hmm.
maybe to just give the experience of, let's say, because I know you guys run the open mic nights, which are great on here, but yeah, I guess just give that experience of, let's say, going to an open mic night and hearing someone read their poetry and seeing them. So seeing them do it and seeing them go through the emotions that as they're speaking the words. So yeah, I feel like the closer maybe we can get towards the real life experience of hearing poetry, maybe
Yeah,
the more popular it can become.
yeah, definitely. Like I said, yeah, hearing someone share their words. I don't want to say one is more. There's something very personal about it. Like when we do the poetry spaces with Digipedia, and I mean we have, and like I said, Chelsea and Brian are here, and Mad Mac was here earlier. Um, Man, there's some moments in that space that you can't that are genuine human experiences that we're sharing. It's through Twitter Space um, that you feel, you know, that you really like feel that moment, and it's something I'm really appreciative of too. Um, to be a part of that with Digi and everyone that's been involved.
Yeah, that's really great that you guys got that going on. Um, if you had to give one piece of advice for people wanting to write more poetry, better poetry, what would you say?
Uh, I think the daily practice was something that really, you know, fostered a lot of creativity and really made me feel in tune. I think it's just like anything, right? Like practice, you know, just doing something um, over and over and refining that craft. And by no means am I any kind of you know expert or anything. Like I said, I don't have any kind of traditional training with poetry, but just doing it, you know, just spending the time, putting in the work, um, and not caring about like I said, just being involved in the process and not being worried about the outcome and sharing it and so on. Just enjoying it. You know, I think anytime that you enjoy what you're doing, it's 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 just a more I don't know how to say it. It's just it's a more genuine place that it's coming from. You know, you're not
Yeah,
forcing it.
yeah, it's more likely to be authentic, and ultimately, I guess it's more likely to be successful if you want to put it that way. But yeah, so
Yeah.
yeah, practice and enjoying the process, and those are great pointers. And lastly, do you have a favorite poem you've written? That, like, let's say if someone wanted to check out your work in just one poem, which one would you recommend? And either
Uh,
you can read it out, or I can just link it later on in the description.
that I've written. Um, I don't know. I know a lot of people have resonated with the journey piece I did on Foundation.
Mhm.
And it's kind of like I said, it's about where the you know it's about the journey and not the destination, but it was more than that. It was actually inspired by a student of mine. Like I mentioned, I'm a teacher outside of this, and I had this student who just tremendously, tremendous potential, but she just wasn't really into school and academics. And I just, I guess it was kind of, I wrote it and shared it with her, hoping to, I guess, kind of inspire her um, to strive and to really work to realize that potential. And so that one, um, I think definitely is one that I resonate with. But it's hard to say. It's like everything kind of captures a different feeling, so it kind of
Yeah,
depends on what you're feeling and so forth. Yeah.
yeah, of course. No, thank you for putting that. I'll make sure to put the link to that poem in the description. But yeah, Rob, thank you so much for sharing this last hour with me. I feel like it's flown by. Um, yeah, it's been great to learn more about your journey, and it's been a very inspiring conversation in general. Would you have any conclusive remarks you want to make, or anything you want to remind people about, or anything you have coming up you want to tell people, anything like that?
I mean, I just want to express gratitude, man. I appreciate you having me on. I appreciate you and your presence in this space and what you're doing as an artist. And I know there's a lot of work that goes into creating these podcasts and everything that you're doing. So I just want to say thank you for having me on, and just being you. I relate with a lot of the things that you should, and I'm saying this from a very genuine place. And then I also want to just say thank you to everyone that's tuned in. I've shouted them out like three times already or two times, but Chelsea, Bryony, a lot of the other people here I'm not familiar with, but thank you for listening in, and anyone that listens to this listens back to it later too. Just thank you all.
Thank you very much, man. I really appreciate your words, and I also appreciate your presence and what you're doing in the space. And of course, thank you for collecting my work as well. That means a lot.
Of course, man.
Yeah, I wish you all the best for the future, and best of luck with your NFT journey.
Thanks, brother. Appreciate you, Nima. Thanks, man.
Thanks a lot, man. Enjoy the rest of your day, and speak to you next time.